Hello, and welcome to the first ever PCBC Virtual Education Series. My name is Mike Sturdivant, and I'm the Conferences Director at PCBC. As an industry, we've always had to be resilient, be nimble, and adapt quickly, and that's never been more true than right now. But the great news is, as housing pros, we were built for change. Over the next 4 weeks, you will hear from some of our most popular thought leaders. Today, we have Jay Walker-Smith, Chief Knowledge Officer, Kantar Consulting. Walker has spoken at PCBC over a dozen times. Those who have seen him know why we keep bringing him back. Those who have never seen him are in for a real treat. On behalf of PCBC and the California Building Industry Association, we thank you for your support and hope you enjoy the series. And now, Jay Walker-Smith.
Thank you very much, Mike. So let me do a couple of things here first. So I want to share my screen, and that is going to come up. And then I want to put my slides in the slideshow, and I think we are good to go at this point. So thank you very much. I appreciate that a lot. It's great to be back at PCBC. It's my favorite place to speak every year, although this year I'm actually speaking at PCBC from my house. So it's a new kind of virtual experience and the same sort of thing for all of us. So welcome. I hope you find this educational series to be valuable. What I want to do is offer you a few headline thoughts here today about the marketplace at hand in this moment in time and how consumers are adapting and what we need to do to help consumers move forward through this particular moment. I'm going to offer you some broad overarching thoughts, but I hope you can find them helpful as a few thoughts on the direction of travel in the marketplace. And I think the key idea here is to see what we can do with these insights about the consumer mindset to begin to reactivate critical parts of the economy and of our marketplace that can help move our businesses forward. Now, before I do that, let me just add that if you're interested in some more detail about this, we've done a lot of work around the coronavirus pandemic, as well as all of the protest demonstrations that have now broken out around the world, this kind of confluence of things occurring in this moment in time. And you can find a lot of this work on our website under the Inspiration tab. I'm actually going to pull a lot from different parts of the work that we have been doing, and I hope you'll find that helpful in thinking about where the marketplace is today. So with that, let me get started. Here's the central challenge that we face in the marketplace today. This is the business imperative of the moment. There are a lot of other things we've got to do, but they have all got to be directed towards this key imperative, and that is reactivating demand in the marketplace. The question at hand is how to get the economy moving again. We have seen an historic drop in demand of all sorts, and we have seen a shift in the character of demand as well. So it is a moment in time that has affected all parts of the economy in lots of unusual ways. And we'll explore a little bit of this here right up front. But the critical question is, what can we do to reactivate consumer demand in the marketplace? Now, I want to approach the answer to this question here today by looking at 4 critical elements of this issue of reactivating demand. I want to talk a little bit about the character of demand. I want to talk about the prerequisite for reactivating demand. I want to take a look at the future of demand, and in particular, I want to offer you a framework for thinking about where the future of demand is headed. And then finally, I want to touch on the other thing that's happening now, not just the pandemics, but the protest and the ways in which they have intersected and come together to create some new opportunities in the marketplace going forward. So character, prerequisite, future, and inclusivity. Now, as we look at consumer attitudes in our data, we see that consumers overwhelmingly believe these days that the disruption that we are facing is going to be here for a while. This has grown actually over the course of this pandemic disruption. But the percentage of consumers in our US Monitor research who say that the disruption to all aspects of our lives, from the global economy to our daily lives, is going to last a year or longer, has increased significantly just over the course of the past several weeks. And indeed, we see that consumers feel that this is something that they are going to have to prepare themselves for over the long term. But there's a paradox in this, because not only do consumers think this is going to last a while, consumers are also increasingly abandoning their pessimism about how deep of a crisis this is likely to be. In fact, when we ask consumers whether they expect an economic crisis to occur over the next 12 months, a recession in particular, you can see in December, nobody really believed that. But in April, it was about half of all US consumers and has since declined by about 10% from there. So it's now just 46% of consumers. The good news of this is that there is something in the marketplace for us to appeal to as we look to reactivate demands with consumers. There are some glimmers of optimism among consumers that we can build from. So notwithstanding the fact that consumers believe this is going to take us a while to get through, they are increasingly less concerned about some of the negative consequences that we're going to have to face. And I want to explore this in a little more detail because I know that that seems a little bit counterintuitive. But in fact, this is exactly what we see when we look at these results by generation. So you see from April to June that there was a decline in economic anxiety among millennials and Gen Xers, the key consumers in the marketplace today, as well as a decline across all different racial and ethnic groups. In fact, there is a key phenomenon buried in the aggregate data that you can see about consumer attitudes and consumer impacts that we need to call out. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of charts from economist Raj Chetty at Harvard University, who has actually gotten a lot of press over the last week or so for a presentation he did looking at a database of payments data that gave him some insights into consumer spending patterns since the beginning of this pandemic. Now, in fact, some of the things that Raj has found have already been found by other economists and even by some of the work we've done internally at Kantar. But Raj's charts put this in very stark perspective. So what you see here is consumer spending levels from the beginning of the pandemic until just a week or so ago. The green lines show rich people, essentially. The blue lines show lower income people. What you see here in the middle of the chart is that as soon as the lockdowns began to occur, consumer spending fell off a cliff. And then consumer spending began to recover among lower income consumers, but has really not recovered among higher income consumers. In fact, these are the consumers that have more discretionary income and who are the biggest part of the economy anyway. They're able to self-isolate, work from home. They're not really essential workers for the most part, so they're not out having lunch during the middle of their workday. So their spending has significantly declined. And they didn't get any of the money from the federal stimulus package. All of that money went to lower income consumers. So the real economic crisis that we're facing right now is really a pullback by rich people. In fact, we'd already seen these kind of results, as I mentioned, in other analyses that have already been done. And this is one that I called out in a webinar I did towards the end of April. And what you see here on the left is restaurant spending per capita, looking at higher income consumers in the red and lower income consumers in the blue. And this is a national sample, again, looking at payments data. And the Chicago Fed in this analysis observed that almost all of the loss in revenue for restaurants has come from higher income consumers. The spending by lower income consumers barely budged. In fact, it's no surprise when you look at results like this that you see, depending upon the survey, and not just our surveys, but everybody's surveys, that anywhere from about 30 to 40% of all consumers throughout the course of this pandemic have said that the financial impacts have not really affected their household budgets at all. In fact, I've been saying to a lot of our clients, if you're looking for a target group of consumers to try and be the catalyst for reviving your category or your brand, here's a group of consumers to target. People who are not feeling greater economic necessity or financial worries as a result of this. In fact, what we have seen is that, as I alluded to earlier, is that the federal stimulus has actually brought back a lot of the spending by lower income consumers. Again, a chart from Raj Chetty showing lower income consumers in blue, higher income consumers in green. The dotted line you see there is when the first stimulus checks began to reach people. And the decline in spending among lower income people has not only risen, it is almost back to trend. We are seeing an issue associated with the consumers in the economy most able to afford some of the impacts of this economic decline. And in many ways, actually, the lockdowns were, I hate to put it like this, but a bit of a financial windfall for many households. Not to diminish the losses of jobs, but the economic safety net has been there for many people. And some of the people who have not been working and who have been able to isolate themselves in their homes have also been saving money because they haven't been spending it in ways that they would have otherwise spent it. So a little analysis done by our consulting group found that household spending expenses have gone down on average in the US by about $400 a month. So people have more cash at hand. And that, I think, when we look at this, is why we see certain patterns in the change in spending in the US economy. Again, two charts from Raj Chetty. I've just got one more to go, and then we'll move on to some other kinds of data. But on the left, you see a chart that shows the percentage declines in spending accounted for by different categories, versus on the right there in that box there on the left, the share of spending prior to the pandemic accounted by each of those categories. So in-person services accounted for about a third of all spending prior to the pandemic, but it accounts for 2/3 of the reduction in spending that has occurred since then. Look on the right and compare the spending changes in this downturn to those during the Great Recession that began in 2008. And what you see in those blue bars are durable and non-durable goods, which experienced the greatest declines during the Great Recession. Nowadays, the greatest decline is seen on the far right in that green bar, which is various kinds of services. Spending on durables, in fact, has slightly increased during this lockdown period. This, of course, is one of the reasons why home building has been able to withstand some of this economic impact so well. It's because of the nature of the way in which this particular downturn has manifested itself in the marketplace. But the other characteristic of this particular pattern of spending is that reviving the economy is not as simple as simply reopening stores, because the decline in spending is accounted for by people who can afford to stay out of the market for as long as it takes. They don't have to rush back into the market for economic reasons. And this sort of cluster of very small charts that you can't see shows something in particular. On the left, what you see is this economic analysis from the Chicago Fed that found that the downturn in spending began before any of the lockdowns were put in place by various states. People were already pulling back. Rich people, in other words, were already leaving the economy prior to the lockdowns. So no surprise what you see on the right, this chart from Raj Chetty, which shows that after the lockdowns were lifted, there was no immediate return to prior levels of spending, because it's not about the lockdowns. It's about the fear of exposure to this coronavirus in the marketplace. In fact, in our monitor data, what we have found is that the things people say to us that they are extremely or very worried about are kind of the national economy most of all, but personal health has moved up the list since the beginning of this pandemic and is now the thing mentioned second most often by consumers in America. And look at your job. It's way down there at the bottom. It is health concerns, and it is these health concerns that are critical to figuring out how to reactivate demand. And it's not just physical health, it's mental health concerns as well. In fact, while millennials have been experiencing less economic anxiety over the last several weeks, their level of mental health or their worries have actually gone up. And you'll note at the bottom here, the June numbers for physical health are smaller for millennials than those numbers for mental health. There is a lot of worry and anxiety in the marketplace. And it is worry and anxiety about health that is the key to understanding how we can reactivate demand. Our businesses are ready to reopen, but consumers need better signals, particularly certain kinds of consumers, higher income consumers, in order to come back into the marketplace. Here's a little bit of global data and some of our tracking. This is a 50-country study that we're doing every few weeks to just track people's attitudes around the world. And the number one thing that people say around the world is, as well as within the US, that they need before they will feel safe to return to normal daily life is a vaccine. And then all kinds of other sort of signaling and safety behaviors, but vaccines, number one. We see this in US data as well. Here are some results from the Seton Hall Sports Survey, a very well-known sports survey, in which they asked people if they would feel comfortable coming back to a live sports event without a coronavirus vaccine. And 72%, about 3/4, said, no, I would not. I need a vaccine before I'm going back to a live event. That's the challenge. But the opportunity that you see here below is in this number of 61%. People who are very passionate about sports are willing to take a few more risks. Not everybody, 61% is still a majority waiting on a vaccine, but there is some pent-up demand obvious in these data that we can tap into to help reactivate demand in the marketplace. And remember, these kinds of concerns are creating all kinds of barriers to reactivating the economy. As of noon today, Eastern time, the governors of the three governors, the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, announced that anyone arriving in their states from another state that is currently having a transmission level above a certain threshold will have to quarantine themselves for 14 days once they enter New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut. So there is a lot of concern about these kinds of reassuring signals. And in fact, here's what I think is the most interesting manifestation of that. And it's gotten a few headlines. You might have read some of these. But people are so concerned about hygiene and health and safety that they don't want to touch cash money anymore. Nobody wants to put their hands on dollar bills. And this is not just true in the US, it's true all over the world. These data that you see here on the right are from the Financial Times. And what they show at the bottom is a significant decline in marketplace transactions involving cash, and at the top, a significant decline in people taking money out of ATMs. Nobody wants to touch any currency because people don't feel that it's safe for hygiene. In fact, we have seen this in lots of ways. Behaviors that people say they're going to maintain after this is over in our global data, number one is increased hygiene. And in fact, we've seen exactly that pattern in the tracking that we've done through our group in China. This is a little matrix that shows in the upper right the products that did well during the China lockdowns, and they were all hygiene and disinfecting products. In the lower right are all the products that are doing well after the lockdowns, and you see lots of categories there, but you also see the disinfecting and hygiene products. They are not going away. And in fact, when we interviewed people in our monitor survey here in the US just a few weeks ago and asked them what they're going to spend more on after the lockdowns are over, right up there with groceries is cleaning supplies and personal hygiene, more than healthcare, more than home entertainment. And among our Cultural Streetscapers network, a global network we have of experts in 60 cities around the globe, we asked them how important hygiene is likely to be in each of their markets. And without getting into any of the detail here about the things they said, the point is, no matter what the market was, London, Milan, Shanghai, Moscow, Ho Chi Minh City, you name it, they said that hygiene was going to be the biggest change in those markets going forward. And that's not, and that's very understandable. In fact, there is an analog that enables us to think about what we need to do in this regard. And that is one of the past disruptions that we've been through just in this century, 9/11. Right after 9/11, people were afraid to fly, and so the government put in place tighter airport security. It was a security perimeter that could reassure people that once they were past that perimeter, it was okay to go back to business as usual. We need the same thing again. It's not about terrorism. Instead, it is about health and safety and personal hygiene. Hygiene is now the critical signal. We need a hygiene perimeter that when people get behind that perimeter, they can feel it is safe to go back to business as usual. And of course, we understand this. We are doing lots of things to make people feel comfortable in the ways in which they interact with us in the marketplace, but we need to do more. For example, in South Carolina, just yesterday, the governor announced that there is a new decal that restaurants can qualify for. And if they go through all the protocols related to hygiene and health, they can get this little decal to put on their front door. And if they violate any of those rules, the decal comes off. So it is a way of sending a signal to people that it is safe to eat in this restaurant. This is the process of trying to reopen the marketplace by sending signals that can reactivate demand. Now, of course, home building has been doing pretty well during this pandemic, but the communities that surround our homes and our developments still need help. They still need to be reactivated. And we still need to think in more innovative ways about how we can send the right signals to consumers that these communities are safe and hygienic. And at Kantar, we recommend thinking about this in 4 kinds of ways, looking at spaces in different sorts of ways, new surfaces, new areas, new situations. Look at all your spaces with a new set of eyes. I mean, after all, who would have thought that dollar bills were a space or a surface that people would be nervous about? And yet that turns out to be something that has been significantly impacted by this. And it's not just the current eyes of your audience, it's their new eyes that they bring as they go through changes themselves. So we've got to reconsider who we market to. New needs, new mindsets, new profiles, new kinds of signals. It requires us to innovate with hygiene at the core. In fact, we like to say at Kantar that we think hygiene is going to be the new digital. The hygiene perimeters are going to be here just like airport security perimeters have become a permanent feature of life. And we need to think about how we can innovate around this to create opportunities for reassuring consumers in the marketplace. And that might actually require that we partner in new ways, maybe even partnering with competition to send a message about the category as a whole, as opposed to our brand in particular. From the standpoint of homes and housing, there are perhaps a few thought starters just to think about what this might mean. Home is now considered the safest place to be. And so what are the signals that are required in order to reassure people about their dwelling places? Do we need home wellness technologies? Should we add new features to homes like entryway screening if you want to have a dinner party, or hand sanitizer stations around the house? What about the process of building the house? Is there a competitive advantage in having more hygienic construction processes? And what about innovation around all the finishes and all the appliances and all the technologies that go into homes for self-cleaning surfaces, or even safe rooms that you can go into if someone becomes infected in your family or household? In fact, I talked about home as the new center of life back in a webinar I did on March 25th, and I'm just reproducing one of the slides from that webinar, because the point I made then was that the new definition of health is going to be sanitization, and that's going to lead to more contactless engagement in the marketplace, packaging as a source of competitive advantage, and a greater interest in seals and shields. Life from home, in fact, is going to be more and more the center of people's engagement with other things around them. And as I said, as you can see here on the right, we're going to see a resurging life at home. There will be a little bit less driving, maybe a lot less, but certainly a little. We'll see new kinds of things to service people who are ensconced in their homes. We will see new kinds of entertainments and a huge opportunity associated with home improvement and renovation. And sort of the sci-fi speculation about tomorrow is whether or not home becomes the new car. Don't forget that over the course of a century, we built a global society centered on the automobile. The automobile drives everything in our culture globally today. But as home becomes much more important, it will increasingly displace, for many people, the importance of an automobile as a way of managing lifestyles. And that requires us to think in innovative ways about what we might do with this kind of opportunity at hand. In fact, consumers, when they are asked whether things are going to be new or different in the future, are of mixed views about where things is headed. And again, these are global results. When we've asked consumers to kind of rate themselves on a scale that goes from, I'm going to do what I did before to I'm going to do only new things, it's, all kinds of opinions about that. So there is no one outcome that we should expect in any particular category. Some categories are going to change a lot. Some categories aren't going to change any at all. But we certainly know that consumers anticipate that there is going to be a lot of change. 3/4 of all consumers across all generations do not expect life to be the same. But that doesn't mean that life will be completely different in every aspect of life. Some areas will be exactly the same as before. So the critical question is how to figure out what will be the same and what will be different. And as we look at this at Kantar, we have a little framework that we use to try and figure this out. And I'll share this with you. You can use it for your own kind of brainstorming. And it moves left to right from no change at all to everything changing. Now, on the right is this principle that I refer to as the New Coke principle. You know, New Coke was introduced in 1985. People had taken old Coke for granted. New Coke suddenly reminded them that they liked the old Coke and then they couldn't get it anymore. So they wanted it back. And they wanted it back so much that old Coke was brought back 79 days later. And New Coke just kind of faded from the scene. So there are lots of instances in which being forced to do something new reminds you of how much you miss something old. And so it's the old that will define the future, not the new. In the middle is something I refer to as the asymmetry principle. And this comes from the experience of a lot of categories during downturns. When people trade down, they buy cheaper things. The downturn ends, and then people go back to buying more expensive things or more name brand things. But not everybody. What has been found over and over again is that a certain percentage of the share gains from these cheaper products are retained by these cheaper products after the downturn ends. So it's asymmetric. They don't give it all back. They give most of it back, but they keep a little bit. So asymmetry might apply, and asymmetry is essentially a principle related to the quality of the experience. In general, when you trade down, it's not a good experience, so you can't wait to get back to the old stuff, but sometimes it's just good enough, and I'm not going to go back and spend more money just to get the slightly better experience. And then the final principle is acceleration. Sometimes new things just wipe the slate clean, and emerging trends that were stumbling, trying to gain a foothold in the marketplace suddenly find all the barriers to entry removed, and they become a mainstream phenomenon. We've seen that happen numerous times with past disruptions. Now, these are three kinds of different ways of thinking about whether things will be new or not new. And the question is, which of these is the operative principle for your category or your brand? Because it's that principle that will give you some sense of what normality will look like as you move into the future. So that's the critical thing to figure out. Which principle is your operative principle? Let me just give you kind of my sense of how I think these principles are going to affect what we see unfolding ahead of us. For New Coke, I think we're going to see a return of all things human scale. We've been kind of living these online virtual lives now with everything face-to-face and interpersonal has been taken away from us. It's something that we had taken for granted. We didn't really know how much we were going to miss hanging out with other people, going to public places, enjoying restaurants and live events. And now we're having to live without all of that. We've been reminded of the cultural and personal importance of human scale activities. And indeed, this was already a trend that was emerging in the marketplace before we saw any of this pandemic happen. If you've heard me present at PCBC in the past, you've actually heard me talk about this very phenomenon of human scale. In a digitally immersed world, more and more consumers were looking to get a little bit of human connection back into their lifestyles. And whenever we looked up from our screens, what we saw was a world of farmers markets and cafes and coffee shops and food trucks and urban greenways and all kinds of ways in which we were having human scale engagement. We were just kidding ourselves if we thought we were living only digital lives immersed in various kinds of social media. Human scale was a big part of our lives, and we are going to see that come back as these lockdowns end. And in fact, we've already seen people begin to do this in an almost reckless kind of way at their first opportunity. And no surprise, when we look in our data at Kantar, what we see is when we ask people what they want to do most following the lockdowns, everything at the top of the list is about some kind of human scale engagement. People want to get back to face-to-face connection. And so what does this mean for us in housing and home building? Well, it means, outdoor versions of indoor gatherings. So perhaps in a safe way, we can have face-to-face connection. Maybe there are hybrid forms that we can do in the interim before we get back to the complete end of these lockdowns. Participation by appointment as opposed to everybody crowding into a store at once. Maybe small gatherings, not one big gathering. Distance community events, distance engagement with strangers, a flourishing of our strong family and close friend ties as opposed to the weaker ties of, say, big gatherings or big events. And then, of course, just some of the things we need to do in order to enjoy face-to-face interaction, which is making things like distancing and mask fashion statements as opposed to political statements. Human scale is a new part of how people want to build communities. But there are other categories that will be affected by other principles. So when we look at all things digital, I think we are going to see more asymmetry taking place here. There will be an increase in online shopping, particularly as home becomes the center of life. But I think more importantly, we're going to see virtual establish a strong foothold. Lots of our digital experiences during the lockdowns haven't been all that great. I think we're all, kind of burned out on Zoom meetings, and we're looking for something that is a higher quality form of engagement. And virtual engagement has been that kind of satisfying experience for consumers. Lots of destinations, lots of resorts, lots of premium retailers have been using virtual tours and virtual experiences to deliver that. And you take that in conjunction with entertainment systems and games and advances in VR technologies, and I think we'll see virtual be more and more a part of what we're looking at in the future. And from a home building standpoint, I think we will see virtual become more a part of self-guided tours and live chat, augmented information if you want to view a house from afar, maybe even animated architectural plans, targeting buyers at a distance. You can reach out farther when you can use virtual technologies to bring people to the property, ways to connect residents and communities, enhanced social media as opposed to the way we're doing it right now, and of course, new forms of working as people make home the center of their lives. And we should think about virtual as a source of innovation as we think about what we deliver in a home. How do virtual technologies become core to the concept of designing a home the way entertainment systems have been for a very long time? All about virtual. And finally, when we think about acceleration, there are two things that I want to mention as I wrap up here over the next few minutes. The first of these is the idea of local. All things global have been under pressure now for a long time, and not just politically in the US, but economically and politically and socially in all kinds of ways all over the world. And now with the pandemic, our concerns about global supply chains, about the ability of a virus to cross borders is making us even more nervous about globalism. And it is reviving people's interest in all things local. We see this very clearly in our data. When we ask American consumers, are they more interested in American products? Half say so. And when we ask them if they're less interested in Chinese products or products from China, 60% say so. In fact, the interest in all kinds of things that are local, localized production, localized factories, has been going up in every country around the world. And not just Western markets, but China as well. 87% of Chinese consumers say they are more interested in goods and services from China. Half of them say they're less interested in goods and services from the US. So local will be a bigger part of our future as globalism has kind of been wiped away by the consequences of this pandemic. And as we think about local in our communities and in our home building, it's more scrutiny of provenance, more self-sufficiency of the area in which you live, probably more acceptance of gates and barriers than we've seen in the past. We should remember the paradox, though, that most of this local focus is about physical connections. Information flows are going to remain virtual, going to remain digital, going to remain global. So we'll see a little bit of this paradox as well. And we'll see, I think, a revival of urban areas, not an abandonment of urban areas. Happy to talk about that some in the Q&A. More local entertainments, and with that, a greater appreciation of craft and more of the kind of craft sensibility that we have seen before. There's one final thing, though, that we're going to see accelerated as well, and that is a different role for our brands in society at large. Our brands and our companies are now being expected to take on a public role, not simply a commercial role. Now, when you look back at the long history of marketing since the turn of the 19th century into the 20th, there are kind of three major areas that we have been through. The product area was the first half of the product era was the first half of the 20th century, was all about more and more material things in our lives. The kind of material abundance we enjoy today didn't exist then. And so we have seen material accumulation as a part of that era, and even our advertising philosophies reflected that. But once we got past mid-century, past World War II, into the value shift of the 1960s, there was more emphasis on the person. Product didn't go away, but now you sold the person buying the product. You sold buying as a pathway to a better self. And we've lived in this era of the person ever since. But with the beginning of this century, we began to see a shift in consumer expectations. I want the product well designed for my person, but I now expect brands and companies to deliver a better public as well. I want brands and companies to make a contribution to a better society. And that's a new brand ethic that is going to change how we have to engage with people, home buyers, in the marketplace. You can see this very clearly in our data. In just a few years, we've gone from half to 2/3 globally who say it's important that brands commit to making society better. We have seen in our Brand Z tracking of brand equity around the world that brands who make this positive commitment grow their value substantially more than brands without this commitment. And this is just what you've seen since the financial crisis of 2008. Of course, it's easy to get this wrong, and I won't go into the long explanation of the different ways in which you can miss out on purpose, but it is simply to say that we have got to do this with all of our energies, not simply do it as part of a PR campaign, particularly in the context of the current moment. These global protest demonstrations that have taken millions of people to the streets, demanding a change in the way in which society approaches racial justice. And this set of protest demonstrations implicates brands as well. We have done a lot of work on multicultural values and market opportunities at Kantar. We've been tracking separately the attitudes of African Americans and Hispanics since the early 1980s. We have a very long-term view of this and a fairly strong point of view about the way in which brands need to engage with these communities. And one of the things that we have seen consistently over the years is that African Americans that African Americans tell us that shopping is where they encounter the most discrimination in society. It's not at the hands of the police. It's not applying for a job or at a restaurant. It's the commercial marketplace where they do business with us. And in fact, this is a fundamental reality that is implicating brands in the current set of protest demonstrations. 8 in 10 African Americans, as you can see here on the right, agree. Very few brands really care about the state of African American communities. But African Americans believe that brands have an important role to play in this social conversation about race relations. You can see that there on the left, more so than consumers at large. And when brands do this, they find that African Americans will seek them out, and people in general believe that companies who make these kinds of investments deserve their loyalty. This is a commercial issue as much as anything else. And in the context of a rising expectation that brands should contribute to a better society, this is something that now needs to be on our plate as marketers in this economy. It requires that we become, as we say at Kantar, color brave. And it begins, as you can see here at the top, with more listening and learning about what's going on in the marketplace. Now, this may seem like a commitment to you that is something completely out of the ordinary and something that brands should not be trying to do. But let's remember, last year, the Business Roundtable, this organization that was created decades ago to champion the idea of shareholder value, changed its mission statement to make all stakeholders equal when it comes to corporate decision making. The Business Roundtable, which is an organization of CEOs of the biggest companies in America, has now committed itself to all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And of course, we don't know how to run businesses like that. We went to business school and we were taught how to run businesses that answered only to shareholders. And that's what we've done our entire careers. And now we have new audiences, new stakeholders at the table. And this is a process that we are going to have to learn in this era of the public. And it starts by listening, and it ends by bringing communities together. So those are a few thoughts about what we need to do to reactivate demand in the marketplace. The character of demand is much more watchfulness. It requires, as a first step or a prerequisite, signaling of hygiene and in innovative ways. The future of demand has to be determined category by category. Some of it will be new, some of it won't be new, but there are principles, operative dynamics that we can use to figure that out. And as we do so, we have got to expand the promise of our brands to measure up to the era of the public and the new brand ethic that consumers are bringing to the ways in which they do business with us. Thank you very much. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen. And Mike, are you coming back, or I guess you're sending me questions here in the chat? Okay, so let me just do it that way. So and by the way, if anybody else, I'm told here in the chat, if anybody else has got some questions, please forward them along. So Mike, so one of the questions that has come up here in the chat is whether or not an affordable vaccine brings the marketplace back to where it was before. So yes, in many ways, it would certainly do that. That is clearly what consumers are telling us. You know, consumers are saying there are just things I'm reluctant to do unless a vaccine is available. But once the vaccine is there, then I will go back to doing those things. But the bigger lesson that consumers have learned from this is that there are threats to your health and safety that you hadn't thought about, that you need to take into account, and that require that you do business or operate in some different ways. And so just like airport security has become a permanent feature of life, we are going to see these kinds of hygienic perimeters become a permanent feature of life as well. I do think, though, in the meantime as well, there will have been lots of experimentation about consumers with new ways of doing things. And remember, if that's a good quality experience, then even when we could go back to normal, some consumers are going to stick with the old stuff because they never would have tried it anyway. But since they've tried it, they've learned it's better, and they're going to stick with it. And the acceleration principle, means that a lot of what we've taken for granted has been wiped off the table. So we've seen, for example, risk from globalism. And even if we can, go back to normal with an affordable vaccine, we're not going to go back to the old kinds of attitudes we had about all things local. We're going to see local more important. So yes, there'll be some return, but I do think we're going to see some changes. Let's see. Another question has come up. Are we seeing signs of a desire for less density, i.e. people fleeing to the suburbs? So in search data for housing, you have certainly seen, when people look at real estate listings, an increase in people living in urban areas searching for houses in suburbs, not necessarily rural areas, but perhaps getting out of center city areas or high density urban areas. But I think the thing to keep in mind here is that it's not about density per se. It is about the signaling of hygiene. And so the challenge in these dense urban areas is to find ways to reassure people with signals of hygiene that will keep people from looking to get away. So there's a proactive opportunity here to build in a response to what we're seeing. I think the bigger threat to these high density urban areas is probably going to be challenges to commercial real estate. In every possible way, we have become involved in a massive experiment of changes in lifestyles and work styles. It's forced experimentation that we've been living through. And I think, irrespective of what individual people have learned from it, companies have learned that they can still be productive, at least for many things, without necessarily having to put everybody in one location in an office building. And so I think as we see working from home becoming more important, and this is part of this kind of virtual asymmetric opportunity, we will see some changes to urban areas that come from something like that. A question here about what happens with the multifamily market. Again, I think that's the same kind of thing that I just mentioned with respect to urban areas. The trick here is not to assume that one kind of living pattern is incompatible with a post-pandemic lifestyle. What you need to do is to figure out ways to make it hygienic, to make it safe, and then clearly communicate that that's what you're doing. And so you can have all kinds of living patterns as long as those living patterns carry with them this reassurance of hygiene. Now, it's going to be harder to do in some categories and in some types of living patterns than others, but it's not impossible anywhere. It's just something that we've got to rethink and innovate. Let's see. So when I talk about restaurants, the question is, are our data about everything from fast food to fine dining? So the data you saw from the Chicago Fed was looking at the impact of the downturn on small businesses. So most of what you saw there was the impact on, lunch places, if you will, sandwich shops, deli foods, takeout. as well as fine dining. So the definition there of small businesses was driven by total number of employees, so you could even get small restaurant chains, local restaurant chains. It was not, mass chain restaurants. Fast food has certainly been affected by this. We do have some clients at Kantar who are in the fast food business, and they are experiencing the exact same thing. But their typical customer is not kind of the high income customer that you were seeing in those particular data. Let's see. So one last question here. Do we think the time before people move into new houses will be affected by the desire to wait for the virus to dissipate? I think you're going to have to clean these houses. And I think you're going to have some little guarantee that the house has been cleaned hygienically and that virus has been killed before people move in. I think hotels are going to have to provide the same reassurance. I think restaurants are going to have to up their game when it comes to providing that kind of reassurance. I think that's a service opportunity in the marketplace, but I would certainly agree that it's going to change how people think about occupying these kinds of properties. And I, even when we have a vaccine for the coronavirus, I think we're going to see some continued interest in things having some guarantee of hygiene. So we're coming up on the top of the hour here, a few minutes left, but I think I'm going to draw it to a close. If you've got any other questions, I am happy to follow up. You can find me at jwalker.smith@kantar.com. I want to thank PCBC again for inviting me back and allowing me to share some thoughts here in their virtual series. And thank you all for spending some time here this afternoon. I really appreciate it.